Hello, everyone. I can see that we have a full room. That's great. This is Mehmet Kurds. I'm a lecturer at Yale University Council on Middle East Studies at Macmillan Center, and a Maria Sklodowska-Curie Global Fellow at the London School of Economics. My work relates to anthropology of Islam, Kurdistan, the Middle East, and its diasporas, broadly speaking. And I'm very honored that I'll be facilitating today's talk with Dr. Gülay Türkmen about her new book, Under the Banner of Islam. This is a SEFTUS event, so before I begin introducing Dr. Gülay Türkmen and leave the floor to her, I would like to say a few things about the Center for Turkish Studies. Center for Turkish Studies is an independent and nonpartisan organization based in London. Its mission is to build bridges between the UK and Turkey and the region. SEFTUS was inaugurated with the support of former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg in April 2011. SEFTUS receives cross-party and cross-community support in the UK and Turkey and doesn't owe any allegiance to any government, political party, or institution. SEFTUS provides an open forum promoting expert opinions and debates focusing on Turkey-UK relations, foreign affairs, economic issues, and social developments in Turkey and the region. It hosts experts, leading politicians, academics, opinion formers from Britain, Turkey, and beyond, and organizes monthly speaker series, panel discussions, and dinner events at the UK Parliament, think tanks, academic institutions, and locations in the City of London. SEFTUS conducts research into the changing political, social, and business landscape of Turkey and its region, providing insight into Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. It produced regular briefings and analysis for a range of audiences on a variety of thematic areas. So today we are hosting Dr. Gülay Türkmen, who is a political sociologist and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Graz Center for Southeast European Studies. Her work examines how macro-scale historical, cultural, and political developments inform questions of belonging and identity formation in multi-ethnic and multi-religious societies. She is the author of Under the Banner of Islam, Turks, Kurds, and the Limits of Religious Unity, which came out quite recently by the Oxford University Press, and we'll be talking about this book and this research. Dr. Türkmen has published in several academic outlets, including the Annual Review of Sociology, Qualitative Sociology, Sociological Quarterly, Nations and Nationalism, and New Diversities. So before I leave the floor to Dr. Türkmen, I would like to highlight that you can write your questions in the chat section anytime during the presentation and the Q&A section. I will be able to address the questions to Dr. Türkmen. Gülay will be talking about 25, maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions, beginning with a few questions I might have. Thank you very much, and welcome, Gülay.
Thank you so much, Mehmet. Thanks so much for the kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers for putting this event together. And thank you all in the audience for attending today. So I'm going to be sharing with you today slides, presentation on my book, which came out recently, as Mehmet said. And I'm hoping that we will have enough time in the Q&A to discuss any questions, comments, any feedback you might have. So let me now just share my screen with you, and then we can, oh, just a second. Sorry, why is this not working? Okay, I think we're good now. Sorry, I cannot see. I'm so sorry, something's happening with the, all right. I think you guys all can see now, right?
We also see your presentation, your notes. Maybe you could do a slideshow or something.
All right, okay, so let me just stop this share because it doesn't allow me to share the, we checked this before, but it doesn't show me the other desktop. This is interesting. Just a second. I'll do this. I'm sorry. Technical problem here. Okay, stop. I'm just gonna stop sharing for a second and then we'll try to fix this. What is going on here? Okay, maybe let's try like this. Okay, now it works. Sorry for that. And now I think it works, right? Okay, sorry about that. I don't know why. The world of computers. Okay, so once again, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in today. So as I said, I'm going to be talking about my recently published book under the banner of Islam, Turks, Kurds, and the Limits of Religious Unity. The book has been published in March 2021 by Oxford University Press, and it is available for order at the OEP website as well as on Amazon. And if anyone wants the link, we can share it with you during the Q&A session in the chat. For now, though, let me share with you the cover, which I'm in love with, but of course, I'm biased. So here is the cover. And people have been asking me where this photo was taken, but the cover image is not a photo, it's a painting by this talented painter from Turkey, Turkmen. And it fits really well with the book's main theme, as the book puts at its center Civil Friday prayers, Sivil Cuma namazları in Turkish, which resembled this painting pretty closely, as I'll show you in the next slide. For example, these two photos were taken during Civil Friday prayers in Diyarbakır. Unfortunately, I don't know the name of the photographer, but Diyarbakır is a majority Kurdish city in southeastern Anatolia, and these photos were taken in 2012. I guess the resemblance to the cover art is quite clear now. So what were the Civil Friday prayers and how did they inform the research that gave birth to this book? Civil Friday prayers were initiated in 2011 as acts of civil disobedience by some Kurdish clerics who demanded the right to be able to give the Friday sermons in Kurdish, which was and still is prohibited in the country. For example, in this photo, the sign on the right in Turkish reads, "Those who deny our language cannot teach us our religion." And these prayers emerged in the midst of a period when both the ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP, and the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, highlighted Muslim fraternity as a remedy to the 4-decade-long armed conflict between the PKK and the Turkish armed forces. And in this narrative, Sunni Islam was presented as an overarching supranational identity that could surpass the ethnic divisions between the majority Sunni Muslim Turks and Kurds. And Civil Friday prayers challenged the government's authority both politically and religiously. Politically because the Friday sermon was given in Kurdish, and religiously because they were held out in the streets rather than in state-run mosques. And please keep in mind that all mosques in Turkey are state-run. They are run by the Presidency of Religious Affairs, Diyanet. And the meles, the local imams, prepared their own sermons rather than reading the text prepared by the Diyanet. And during the 2 years they were held, these prayers became quite widespread in most Kurdish majority cities in eastern and southeastern Anatolia. And at their peak, they attracted around 5,000 people in Diyarbakır. Aiming to highlight the ban on Kurdish sermons in particular and the limitations on the Kurdish language in general, they drew attention to the assimilation of Kurds in Turkey. And most importantly, along with other factors, they played an important role in forcing the state to give de facto permission to sermons in Kurdish, if not de jure. And intrigued by these Civil Friday prayers, in this book, I focus on the ambivalent role Sunni Islam has played in Turkey's Kurdish conflict, both as a conflict resolution tool and as a tool of resistance. Although the Kurdish conflict has historically been characterized by a secular nationalist ideology, both on the side of the PKK and on the side of the Turkish state, since the 1980s, different governments have at times resorted to religion to subdue Kurdish nationalism. However, none had advocated Muslim fraternity as strongly as the AKP governments have. Moreover, never before did the secular PKK with Marxist origins display as positive a stance towards Islam as it did during the AKP rule. Especially during the peace talks that took place between 2012 and 2015, the role of religion has become so pronounced in the conflict that both Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the leader of the AKP, and Abdullah Öcalan, the imprisoned leader of the PKK, went on to cite the same hadiths, Prophet Muhammad's sayings, to emphasize Muslim unity and solidarity. Yet, in the summer of 2015, the ceasefire was broken, and in January 2016, Erdogan declared that the peace process is over for good. Since then, clashes have resumed, thousands of people died, and thousands have been internally displaced. Against this background, in the book, I inquire why Muslim fraternity has not resonated well among Sunni, Turks, and Kurds, using the Kurdish case as an opportunity to explore the intricate relationship between religion, ethnicity, and nationalism. I scrutinize the role of religion in ethnic conflicts and ask how do religious, ethnic, and national identities diverge and converge in religiously homogeneous ethnic conflicts. Is it possible for religion to act as a conflict resolution tool? Why or why not? And more specifically, why is it that despite the global increase in the importance of religion, and despite the changing stances of the Turkish state and the Kurdish movement, the two parties have failed to unite under the banner of Islam? And this, under the banner of Islam, this quote, it actually comes from one of Öcalan's statements. I'll talk about that later, but just keep that in mind. And in search for answers to these questions, I take the reader on a journey into the inner circles of religious elites from different backgrounds, non-state appointed local Kurdish millahs, state appointed Kurdish and Turkish imams, heads of religious non-governmental organizations, members of religious orders, and pious politicians. I rely mainly on participant observation in Friday prayers, systematic analyses of newspapers, and politicians' speeches, especially those of Erdogan, and 62 interviews conducted over the course of a year between June 2012 and June 2013 in 3 different cities, Istanbul and the majority Kurdish Diyarbakir and Batman. And in case there are people in the audience who are not familiar with Turkey and who do not know where these cities are, here's a map of Turkey. And Diyarbakir and Batman are located in the southeastern part of the map. And this whole region, eastern and southeastern Anatolia, is where majority of Kurds in Turkey live, Kurds, and also in Istanbul. They also live in Istanbul. And they comprise around 15 to 20% of Turkey's overall population of 85 million. And as I said, in addition to this region, Istanbul also hosts a large population of Kurds. Hence my choice of Batman, Diyarbakir, and Istanbul as cities to conduct research in. So I conducted the interviews during a period when the peace process seemed to be moving smoothly and when co-religiosity seemed to be quite influential in bridging the ethnic divide between Kurds and Turks, at least rhetorically. And the interview data have revealed that, in fact, Sunni Muslim identity was far from influential in uniting religious elites at the time, let alone motivating them to advocate for Muslim fraternity. One of the main reasons why Sunni Islam has failed to unite these Sunni Muslim elites, I argue, is the variation in how these elites conceptualize religious and ethnic identities. Almost all religious elites I talked with agree that Islam can be implemented as a conflict resolution tool. Yet, because they diverge in their interpretations of Islamic teachings and in their conceptualizations of religious and ethnic identities, Islam plays much less an influential role as a peacemaker. To demonstrate this divergence among Turkish and Kurdish religious elites, based on my findings, I developed the concept of religio-ethnic identity, and I put forward a 4-fold typology of identity categories as conceived by these elites. And you see them in this table. The first identity type is religio-ethnic, the second one is ethno-religious, the third one religious, and the fourth one secular ethnic. And I will explain all these categories in a bit with sample quotes, so you will get to understand, I hope, better what they correspond to. Because these categories cannot be considered in isolation from the evolution of certain ideas and institutions since the late Ottoman period, structural changes the political and religious fields have undergone in Turkey since 2002, and the repercussions these changes have had on various actors, I claim that different identity categories, along with institutional and political changes and the ensuing transformation of power and network relations, prevent Islam from acting as a unifying conflict resolution tool in the Kurdish conflict. And I blend interview data with historical institutional analyses and secondary sources. And I demonstrate the symbiotic relationship between the changes in Turkey's religious and political fields and the religious elites' conceptualizations of religious and ethnic identities. And here you see a snapshot of that theory. And to that end, I employ a theoretical framework that attends to not only micro-level identity formation processes or macro-level doctrinal debates, but also a meso-level analysis of religious and political actors and how in their hands theological contents might change shape. And in this presentation, I do not go much into theory, but I would be happy to answer any theory-related questions during the Q&A. Okay, so building on these findings and using the fourfold typology, in the book, I first explain the secular ethnic category in chapter 1. With the help of interviewed data, I display how secular Kurdish political elites envision ethnicity as a category completely detached from religion and how they deem as assimilatory the AKP's attempt to use religion as a unifying tool. The chapter opens with the analogy of green Kemalism, used by some Kurdish political elites to criticize the AKP's Muslim fraternity project. And this line of thinking claims that the AKP is no different than the founders of the Turkish Republic in its intention to assimilate Kurds, and that it differs from the latter only in its employment of religion to that end, hence the allusion to green. And here's a lengthy quote from an HDP official I talked to in Diyarbakir. And the HDP stands for the Pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, the third largest party in the parliament. So I'm going to read the quote because maybe some people don't have their videos on. Kurds in general have a quite positive attitude towards Islam, this person says, the HDP official. Yet, Islam has always been used as a tool of conflict, as a tool of assimilation and oppression against Kurds, whether in the form of Turkish Islamic, Arab Islamic, or Persian Islamic syntheses. Those in power have always employed Islam to exterminate or dominate Kurds. This is why Kurds embrace a critical view of state Islam. AKP officials claim to be religious, but in practice, they are far from that. And Civil Friday prayers symbolize the Kurds' attempt to practice their religion without giving up their own culture and language. That's why the state finds them disturbing. And by banning them, the state is saying either embrace my interpretation of religion or I will not let you practice any other version of religion. And he continues, I will not read the whole quote here, but he was a person who was involved in the leftist movement in the past, and he worked closely with Turkish socialists. And he complained about how Turkish socialists would ask them to suppress their own culture and identity. And when they spoke Kurdish, they were being accused of being chauvinists. He thinks that the AKP is now employing the same logic. And under the disguise of Islamism, he says, they claim that once a Muslim ummah is established, there will be no need for an emphasis on Kurdish identity. And there is no need for you to speak Kurdish, they say. We are fellow Muslims, and that's what binds us. And he continues, as one can see, while socialists deemed Kurds' demands as incompatible with socialism, Islamists deem our demands as incompatible with Islam. No matter how intellectually different these two ideologies might seem, they actually share the same aim, assimilating Kurds and integrating them into the system. So this was a different quote than the one on the screen that you see, but these all come from the same person. So to provide the historical and political background needed to make sense of this metaphor, the chapter then provides a detailed historical account of the role Islam has played in the Kurdish revolts and in the way the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey have handled them since the late 19th century. Then in chapter 2, I turn my gaze to the supranational religious identity and scrutinize the contour of the Muslim unity project. Through interview data, this chapter demonstrates how the belief in Islam as cement comes to life in the discourses of several religious elites who characterize Sunni Islam as an overarching supranational identity and see Muslim fraternity as the only solution to this conflict. Citing certain hadiths and verses from the Quran, they reproduce the belief that Sunni Islam could indeed bridge the ethnic divide between Kurds and Turks. Here's a quote from an interview I conducted with a state-appointed imam in Diyarbakir, and you can see how much emphasis he puts on Muslim unity. He says, "I think the only way out of this deadlock is an emphasis on our common Muslim identity. The Quran asks us to make peace between our brothers. That's what we should do. We should find a common ground with the help of Islam. We believe in the same God. We believe in the same prophet. We fought shoulder to shoulder in the War of Independence to save this country from non-Muslim invaders. So what is it that we cannot share now? Why this fight?" And this approach did not have that many followers among my respondents, only 7 out of 62. But it's still worth scrutinizing in detail as it provides the basis of the main research question I'm dealing with, namely the role of Islam as a supranational identity. Hence, in this chapter, I try to provide a better understanding of the origins of this approach and how and why it came to be embraced by the AKP. Here's another quote by another interviewee, a longtime member of a religious non-governmental organization in Batman. And after telling me about the murders conducted in Batman by the Kurdish Hezbollah, a Batman-originated Islamic group, the PKK, and the state in the 1990s, he makes this metaphor of the nation of Abraham. And he says, the Turks and Kurds are united in Islam. Islam is the strongest link between us. That's what kept us together when the Ottoman Empire dissolved. Hence, we should cling to it. Allah warns us against Shiism in Quran. And he says, hold firmly to the rope of Allah all together and do not become divided. And remember the favor of Allah upon you when you were enemies, and he brought your hearts together and you became by his favor brothers. And there is only one nation for me, and that's the nation of Abraham, he says. Okay, so to provide some historical context, the chapter then goes on to analyze this discourse in relation to the Muslim Ummah and Ottoman pan-Islamism, and demonstrates that rather than Muslim unity, Muslim disunity was the rule from the very beginning in Islamic history. And the reason some of my respondents think that implementing Islam as an overarching identity might help unify Sunni Kurds and Sunni Turks lies in their nostalgic take on the Ottoman Caliphate. And according to this account, Ottomans handled the ethnic differences between Kurds and Turks much better because they implemented Islam as a unifying identity. And in assessing the validity of this claim, in the book, I scrutinize the Ottoman Caliphate through a detailed historical narrative. And I argue that this supposition is correct only to a certain extent. While Islam indeed played a great role in unifying Ottoman Muslims against the empire's non-Muslim subjects, even the Ottomans were forced to recognize the ethnic differences among their Muslim subjects. And as such, although Islam was a powerful bond between the Muslim subjects of the Ottoman Empire, it was still limited in its ability to suppress ethnic differences, let alone form a unified ummah. And this nostalgia for a peaceful Ottoman past in which different ethnic groups lived in harmony also constituted the core of the AKP's insistence on presenting Islam as the solution to the Kurdish conflict, I argue. And in the last section of the chapter, I demonstrate, building on systematic analyses of statements, especially by President Erdogan, I demonstrate how the AKP came to embrace a pan-Islamic solution to the Kurdish conflict, and how its attitude towards Kurds compares to that of Ottomans towards its Muslim subjects. And I argue that Erdogan's Muslim Turkish citizenship was way too reminiscent of Abdülhamid II's Muslim Ottoman citizenship. And in chapter 3, I go on to show how and why AKP's approach and this conceptualization of a unifying Muslim identity has not been successful in the end. And in chapter 3 and chapter 4, I present religio-ethnic and ethno-religious identities as important reasons for the failure of Muslim Unity Project. Chapter 3 introduces religio-ethnic identity via a focus on civil Friday prayers as contentious performances. And following the lead of Peter Berger, who in The Sacred Canopy described religion as both a world-maintaining and a world-shaking force capable of legitimating or challenging power. In the chapter, I provide an overview of how the institutional and policy changes introduced during the AKP rule made possible the employment of Islam as a tool of resistance in the hands of civil Friday prayer imams. Building on interviews with these imams, as well as observations from these prayers, I draw attention to the imams as autonomous agents of contestation who have turned religion from a tool of assimilation into a tool of nonviolent resistance. Though acknowledging Islam's capacity to unite, these imams are quite suspicious of the Muslim unity discourse, and by quoting certain Quranic verses and hadiths that highlight ethnicity as a religious, God-given identity, and they use fitri here, they claim that rejecting one's Kurdish identity and assimilating into Turkish culture means going against God's will. Hence, rather than the ethno-religious approach, these imams promote a religio-ethnic identity, which traces the origins of ethno-national identity back to religious identity. And as such, religio-ethnic identity, as conceptualized by these imams, functions as an important reason for the weakness of Sunni Islam as a unifying identity. And you can see some of the quotes from these imams here. I would like to read just one. Turkish Muslims keep saying we are religious brethren. However, in their eyes, we are brothers so long as they, the Turks, are the elder brother. And chapter 4 revolves around ethno-religious identity and argues that another reason the idea of Muslim unity does not work well in the Kurdish conflict is the strength of Turkish nationalism among Turkish religious elites. Through interview data, this chapter displays how Turkish religious elites who seemingly advocate Islamic unity end up privileging Turkish ethnic identity upon further interrogation. While they discursively promote Muslim unity, in practice, they advocate a Muslim identity very much shaped by Turkish nationalism. The elites in this category are usually comprised of state-appointed Turkish imams and some Turkish Muslim elites, especially those associated with the Gülen movement. And instead of talking about ethnicity as a God-given identity, they focus on the Quranic difference between negative and positive nationalisms, and they claim that most of the Kurdish imams practice negative nationalism, which is forbidden in Islamic teachings. To back their argument up, they usually refer to Quranic verses that emphasize the brotherhood of Muslims. And here on this slide, you see a quote by a state-appointed imam in Diyarbakir. And he says, the only nationalism Islam accepts is positive nationalism, which emphasizes the brotherhood of all Muslims. It sees all Muslims as equal and it does not distinguish between them. Hence, what we need to do is to establish a Muslim union. The question is, which country can establish and lead such a union? None of the Arab states can do it. Indonesia, Iran, or Pakistan can't do it either. Only Turks can accomplish this because they actually ruled the Muslim world for 600 years. And here he alludes to the Ottomans. Here's another quote by a Turkish Gülen movement member. He starts by an emphasis on Muslim unity, but as he progresses, one can see how he prioritizes Turkishness and looks down upon Kurds. And I'm going to read this. We are one single body. Turks comprise our mind, while Kurds comprise our strength and courage. We should act together. We should not get divided. If we do, then we'll be defeated. Let me give you an example. Back in the day, Muslim armies were making plans to conquer a particular city. The Kurds said, let's go conquer it now. The Turks said, no, let's wait for a suitable time. And the Arabs kept silent. Eventually, they all listened to the Turks, waited for the suitable time, and ended up conquering the city. This is why Kurds and Turks need each other. Left to themselves, the Kurds are not even able to elect a village headman, muhtar. Rumor has it that in one village, 60 Kurds killed each other during local elections. So you can see how it gets really discriminatory towards the end, even though it starts with this emphasis on Muslim unity. And with the help of a historical overview, in the chapter, I then explain in detail how this attitude and the endurance of Turkish nationalism among Turkish Muslims has its roots in the formation of the Turkish nation state as a Sunni Muslim entity. I then turn my gaze to the Turkish Islamic syntheses, and the chapter goes back as early as the mid-19th century to trace the emergence of Turkish nationalism and its merger with Islam. And in the second part, I scrutinize how the AKP's discourse on the Kurdish conflict has oscillated from one characterized by Islamic Turkish syntheses to one characterized by Turkish Islamic syntheses. And I show how the AKP has replaced its emphasis on Muslim fraternity with an emphasis on Turkish Muslim nationalism recently. So while the different conceptualizations of ethnic and religious identities by Sunni Muslim, Turkish and Kurdish elites have definitely played an important role in preventing their unification under the umbrella of Sunni Islam, it would also be misleading to claim that it is the only reason that has hindered the deployment of religion as a peacemaker in Turkey's Kurdish conflict. As identity categories do not exist in a vacuum and they are historically and politically grounded, I contend that related structural factors should also be taken into consideration when discussing this issue, especially the spillover effects of the civil war in Syria, the establishment of an autonomous Kurdish region, Rojava in northern Syria, the historical trajectories of both Kurdish and Turkish nationalisms in Turkey, the non-transparent nature of the peace talks, and the continuous mistrust between the government and the Kurdish movement, the vital role played by secular nationalist actors, both in the Kurdish movement and in some segments of Kurdish and Turkish societies, the importance of Alevi Kurds in certain Kurdish majority regions and in the upper echelons of the Kurdish movement, and last but not least, the HDP's decision to not support Erdogan's bid for presidency are among the factors that have all contributed to the termination of the peace process in the summer of 2015. In such an environment, it was quite hard for Sunni Islam to act as the cement it was envisioned to be, I argue. Thank you all so much. I'm looking forward to the Q&A session, and I'm looking forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you very much, Gülay. It was a great summary of the book, and for the audience who wants to learn more, I think the book is great examination of the historical sociological processes of how religion has failed to serve as a unifying factor. I have so many questions, but I would like to pose a few to begin with, and please write your question in the chat session so I can address them to the Dr. Gülay Türkmen. First, I would like to hear more about the research process. As you said, that you have conducted the research in a relatively peaceful environment, but then like in the conclusion, you talk about like how everything has turned upside down in the face of the Syrian civil war and the urban conflict that has taken place in the Kurdish region of Turkey. I wonder how this has informed and like kind of impacted your approach to this question. And at the same time, also, I'm curious about, as a Turkish scholar, how your positionality has informed the responses and reactions of your interlocutors, especially the Kurdish mullahs and sayyidas. And kind of, I wonder whether you could elaborate on the political theology of this particular version of Turkish Islamism. Is it an invitation to a fraternity that is equally representative and combining, bringing or bridging between the Kurds and Turks, or is it an invitation to the Kurds to submit to the religious fraternity in the face of eradicating their ethnic identities? This is the second question. And the third question is about this quote by one of your informants who talk about this verse from Quran, which says, roughly, hold on the rope of Allah and don't be divided. And of course, this is it's a very common excuse by the Turkish Islamist, ordinary Turkish practicing Muslims. So I'm curious about this division whenever the Kurds demand their rights, because I mean, as it is obvious in the last 10, 20 years, that this ummah or this imaginary ummah, this imaginary fraternity is not being affected by the involvement of Turkey in Syrian war, is not being affected by their dirty drone wars in Libya, their involvement in several other fronts when we see like, religious sectarian divides and conflict across the Middle East. But when it comes to the Kurds and their basic rights, they always talk about this ummah being divided. So I'm quite curious why this is the case. This is all for now from me. I might have some other questions in the process. Someone's sharing their
screen. Yeah, I think they did it unintentionally, but this is Klaus Schilling, I think.
I see it might be one of our co-hosts.
Okay, all right.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Mehmet, for these questions. Let me start with the research experience and my positionality. So yes, I mean, when I conducted the research in the region, of course, there was a much more hopeful atmosphere, and people were kind of like, the peace negotiations were going on. I mean, when I started in 2012, there were still some clashes, but it was not comparable to what is happening right now or what has happened afterwards. So people were super hopeful, and they were much more willing to talk. I think if I were to go to the region now, it would be really difficult for me to actually get access to some of the communities that I had access in the past, or people might be a bit more reserved and they might be a bit reluctant to talk, understandably so, especially considering the increasing repression in the recent years. So it was relatively easier, but of course, being ethnically Turkish and conducting research in a male-dominated, like it's a very male-dominated area, right? Like, I mean, not area, but this group of people, like imams. Only two of my interlocutors were women, and the rest were men. So it definitely had its advantages and disadvantages, these positionalities. And I was doing a PhD in the United States at the time, and I was telling them I'm coming from the United States, and I had these like direct questions, like, are you a spy? Is the US paying you? Or, why are you here if you are not Kurdish, if you are not? And they assumed that I'm not religious, and they would ask me questions like, why are you interested in this topic? And of course, these were obstacles in terms of like establishing trust. But once we established trust, then there were also instances where some people were, we are very grateful that you came all the way to listen to us and to give voice to our ideas. So it had its advantages and disadvantages, but I do share some of them in the book. But I'm also now writing a piece on this specific topic, on my positionality as an outsider researcher on so many levels, and I hope that it will be published in the coming years, so you can read more in detail my reflections on that. And in terms of the political theology of Turkish Islam, so yes, I mean, most of the Turkish Muslims I talked to had this more assimilatory approach, I would say. Like they actually wanted the Kurds to just like bow down to their demands and to kind of fit in, but not all. I mean, there were also some dissenting voices among them. And for example, I share this in the book too, this quote. There was this Turkish Muslim who said that, in the past we supported Bosnians, we supported Palestinians, we supported all these different Muslim groups, and we were never actually looked down upon for that. But once we started supporting the Kurds, then people started calling us Kürtçü. It's like a Kurdophile, Kurd lover. I think we could translate it into English like that. but no one in the past called us, Arapçı, or like it's just this this attitude among, like, the dominant attitude among Turkish Muslims was more in the line of assimilationist policies, but there were dissenting voices, as I said, among them. And the third question was on what? Sorry, I forgot to write that.
The division of Ummah.
Yeah, the division of Ummah. Yeah, I mean, it is. So it was, as I show in the book, it was historically always this concept of this utopic idea of Ummah has actually always been a utopia, and in practice we don't really see it being implemented. But it is very much still in the discourse. Like alive in the discourses of certain religious elites, because of this kind of almost like distorted historical understanding of the Ottoman Caliphate, and they don't really even they have this nostalgic take on the Ottoman Caliphate, and we see that being reflected very much in their discourses. So it's not really, and I think like my when I was writing this book, it was more like an invitation on my part for a reality check, because at the time, like the media, politicians, and all these like public discourse, it was very much emphasizing this Muslim unity idea, and I was kind of trying to highlight the fact that it is not actually working.
I see. Thank you very much, Gülay. I have one last question, and then I'll read out some of the questions that is being posed so far. And that is about the liberation theology, especially in regards to the civil Friday prayers and kind of the civil disobedience that came from the practicing Muslim Kurds. In the book, you place this practice as something in between resistance, religious resistance, and liberation theology, highlighting that we cannot consider this as a liberation theology, which I'm not totally in the same opinion with you. So I would like you to kind of elaborate on that. Why do you think it is not a liberational theology? And maybe for the audience who is not familiar with the discussion, you could say something about the liberation theologies.
Yeah, no, I mean, I kind of situated in an in-between position, because the liberation theology, which emerged in Latin America, in South America, by Catholic clerics, I think, like, institutionally speaking, like, these clerics, even though they were employed by the Catholic Church, and they were it was kind of like a resistance against the Church and its dominant interpretation, and they were trying to highlight more almost a leftist interpretation of Catholic teachings. And in the Turkish case, and with the Kurdish imams, I think one difference that we can see with from the liberation theology is because we don't have this like a parallel institution like the Catholic Church. Although we have the Diyanet, so that could still be seen as a, like this central institution that controls most Islamic teachings in the country. Some of these imams were never employed by the Diyanet. So in terms of like their resistance, they are not really affiliated with this institution, the Diyanet. Some of them were. They are either retired Diyanet imams, or some of them just resigned. But in the institutional sense, I think it is different than what we observe in the liberation theology, and it lasted, shorter than what we observed in the liberation theology. But of course, there are similarities as well. So one can observe both similarities and differences, I think.
Thank you, Gülay. There is much to say about that, but let's leave it there. So Sardar Aziz, one of the audience, is asking that, highlighting that most Kurds are Shafi, different from Turks Hanbali. Well, it should be Hanafi. Have you noticed this different as a barrier of disunity? Maybe, like, in addition to that, I would like you to elaborate on the particularities of Kurdish religiosity. What is it different from, for example, a Turkish Muslim or Turkish Islam?
Well, I mean, to answer that specific question on like Shafi and Hanafi differences, so I asked about this to some of my interlocutors, and they downplayed it. They said that, oh, it is just something that one can observe in the rituals, in terms of like theological interpretations. It doesn't really affect, it doesn't really translate into radical differences, they said. But then I was giving a presentation on this topic and at another academic event, and there was a historian among the audience, and they said that they once did research where Shafi imams claimed that, you know, if it comes to this difference, like Shafi Hanafi difference, we could be, you know, killed just because we are different and that we are not Hanafi. So apparently these people think that, you know, this difference can become very important and very radical if, you know, push comes to shove. So it wasn't something that I observed among my interviewees. Even though I asked about this specifically, as I said, they downplayed it. They thought, you know, that it's not a big important difference. But I think it is still there as a potential fault line. If it's triggered, then it can definitely turn into an important difference as a barrier of disunity. So,
Yeah. Well, I understand like why they might have downplayed this difference between Shafi and Hanafi schools of Islam. Both are under the umbrella of the Sunni Islam. But then, like, Shafis are mostly theologically are connected to Imam Ash'ari, whereas the Hanafis are following the Imam Maturidi, which are like ontologically representing different theological approach to reason, to world, to cosmology, and so on and so on. But at the same time, I think Kurdish religiosity is very much informed by the Sufi tradition, especially in the last few hundred years, which is something different that we see in the general Turkish religious landscape. And I think kind of the habitus that create both is different from each other, whereas kind of the religion that is being taught in the schools are based on this Hanafi Maturidi school, and usually it disregards that the Shafis exist. And I think until recently, Diyanet, as the main institution responsible for religious affairs, did not have any publication in the Shafi school, and more recently with Mehmet Görmez administration, kind of they try to kind of be more inclusive and have some publications about the Shafi school. So Michael Reynolds is saying, thank you for the excellent presentation. I have two questions. Did the AKP's vision of a Turkish-Kurdish solidarity grounded in Islam differ in any significant way from that of Milli Görüş, or was it largely the same? And the second question, according to Rushen Çakır, in one of the postcard episodes, Öcalan in the early 1990s sometimes praised Islam and collaborated with Turkish Islamists. Can you say something about the evolution of Öcalan's view on Islam? Have they evolved, or has he always viewed Islam only instrumentally, something to sometimes be exploited for the sake of the PKK's cause, or does he retain a genuine sympathy for Islam?
Okay, thank you so much for those questions. So to the first question, I mean, the AKP, of course, it is a spin-off of Milli Görüş, or it has its roots in Milli Görüş. But I think they were different to a certain extent, and they differ to a certain extent, because we see even like with the earlier Islamic politicians, this idea of using Islam as a tool to calm down Kurdish demands or to assimilate Kurds. But I think what we also saw in the early period of the AKP was a more like they embraced this Ottoman concept of millets. You know, and the Ottomans had this millet system where you had different communities categorized according to their religion and their sectarian beliefs. So and the AKP, I think, like implemented this idea of kind of like the acceptable Turkish citizen being Sunni Muslim, but also there is room for non-Muslims as long as, you know, they do not demand too much. And you don't really see that in the Milli Görüş attitude. Like there's not that much acceptance of non-Muslim communities. But of course, I mean, like AKP had this openings, they called it, you know, the Armenian opening or the Kurdish opening, and where they got in touch with these groups. And I think that that was different than the Milli Görüş. And in terms of the second question, of course, I mean, one can never know, right, whether Öcalan really retains a genuine sympathy for Islam or not. But I talk about the book. I mean, if you don't know him personally, I think you cannot say whether, and I don't know. So, but I talk in the book about the evolution of the PKK's views on Islam based on their publications and on statements, public statements. And you see that in the early, like in 80s or so, you don't really see an emphasis on Islam, but it's only in the 90s, early 90s, that we see this turn towards Islam. And I speculate in the book that this is due to the demand in their base, the Kurdish base, the population. There is really like there are quite a lot of religious pious Kurds, and the PKK, even though it emerged as a secular movement, I think it could no longer you know, turn a blind eye to its base's demands. So it kind of had to take into consideration that there are like a big chunk of the population is pious and religious. So, and another reason was, of course, like there's the Hezbollah as a competitor group. So the PKK had to also situate itself as the real defender of Islam against the Kurdish Hezbollah. So that's when we see a change in Öcalan's statements. In the 80s, they even shied away from, for example, mentioning the early Kurdish revolts because they were led by sheikhs who were Naqshbandi sheikhs in the Ottoman times. So there's that, and in 2000 we see, especially with during the time of Civil Friday prayers, we also, for example, saw these two Kurdish Islamic conferences put together by the Kurdish movement. And I think that was also an initiative by Öcalan to highlight this Islam and the unity of Turks and Kurds. As I said, under the banner of Islam actually is a quote that comes from Öcalan's letter that he sent to the Nevruz celebrations in 2013 in Diyarbakir. So, yeah. So there's an evolution in his ideas towards like a positive view of Islam.
Yeah, I think everyone approaches religion as a utilitarian tool in the Middle East these days, like, you know, either to be Islamist or Salafi or this and that. But at the same time, like this division that is being propagated by the Turkish state and its apparatuses, that the Kurdish movement itself is secularist and is against religion, is just another Another propaganda that kind of like, want to create further fragmentation among the Kurds, because in reality, the social base of the Kurdish movement are either practicing Muslim Kurds, or at least they have no issue with the religion and so on and so on. But I think we see this tendency generally occurring in Turkey when it talks about this secularist religious divide, where is no space is given to a third position, which is the Kurdish position. And I think it's quite significant in many ways, that needs to be highlighted in terms of the evaluation of religion, politics, and many other issues in the Turkish political sphere. Okay, so another Siyavesh Owaisi is talking about the Islamic fraternity in Iran, and this time around the Shia Islam. The reason ruling ideology in Iran is an extremist version of Shiism is because to provide a common identity among a very ethnically diverse country of Iran. The main goal was to bring Azeri Turks of Iran under Persian-ruled Iran. During the last 20 years, particularly the district kept losing its power, and the Turks of Iran emphasized more on their Turkish identity than their common religion with Persians. The Sunni Kurds in Iran are not Shia and not Persian. Therefore, they are under very brutal and straight suppression by the Islamic regime of Iran. Once needed, the Shia Turks are siding with the regime when it comes to suppressing the Kurds during the last 100 years. And I think kind of our colleagues Kemal Soleimani and Ahmed Mohammed Pur, both from Iranian Kurdistan, have written a few articles about this aspect of the Shia Islam and its usage against the religious and ethnic minorities in Iran. I was wondering if you could tell something.
No, I mean, that's it was also like, again, something that came up in the interviews of how like in Iran too, the regime is using using religion when it comes to like Kurds to suppress Kurdish demands, and most of the Kurdish imams were saying, like in different countries where the Kurds are located, it is only when it comes to Kurdish demands that all of a sudden, religion is being used as this suppressive tool. And I think, like we see this in the case of Iran too, right? So,
yeah. So, not only in the case of Iran, I think in the case of all parts of Kurdistan, we see this utilization of religion. I mean, it was Saddam who called his brutal operations as Anfal, a passage from Quran. It was the Turkish soldiers, Turkish military invasion in northeastern Syria, when they were using Surah Al-Fath in all mosques, which essentially talks about the peace agreement between the Meccan polytheists and the Muslims of Medina. But then, like, the utilization of Al-Fath or Al-Anfal, or like, religion at the hand of the Ba'ath in Syria and earlier in Iraq, I think kind of like indicate a common strategy, a common governmental strategy that is being used against the Kurds. Yeah. So I wonder whether this is just like, religion as a colonial tool rather than religion as a unifying factor.
I mean, they present it, of course, as a unifying tool, but at the end of the day, it's rather than unifying, it kind of divides because it is very much covered by these subtle intentions of just assimilation and discrimination, I think. So.
Okay, so Mehmet Canbeyli is saying, I think instrumentalizing Islam for politics is not limited only to the Kurdish problem. AKP has an ideal society ruled by rules of Islam. I don't know what it means. Diyanet is a huge organization for it and is an active in every political debate. However, for Kurds, it has no practical value. First, due to language barriers, that Islam is taught and Quran is read in Arabic. And the second, new generations demand jobs, cultural independence, education in mother language, etc., whereby just being a Sunni Muslim cannot satisfy these needs. In a way, kind of like, if we use an analogy, that the Kurdish problem is not a religious problem. It's not a problem of religion, but the remedy that is proposed, that is being proposed, is religious. And I think kind of this paradox creates a lot of problems because, like, you know, on one hand you have the civil rights issue, you have, like, you know, all rights around equality and citizenship, and on the other hand there is this proposal that, okay, Islam can resolve everything. But really, is it the case?
Well, I mean, I think it is not working because, as this question has underlined, this is not a religious issue, right? And when you propose a solution based on religious unity, then you are leaving out certain segments of the population, like the non-religious people, or the Alavis, which constitute an important group both in the Kurdish and Turkish populations. So I think that's why, like, it is not a very a pluralist solution. It only speaks to the religious people in the society, and that would not work in the long run. So I think even if it were to be accepted by the religious people on both sides, we would still have, I think, people who would not be happy with such a solution because they do not necessarily embrace these religious teachings. So I think in that sense, it was doomed to fail from the very beginning, one can say, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so Çiğdem Balum is asking, how do you interpret the Nurcu movement? Said Nursi is a Kurd. Where does Said Nursi fit in all this? I think there isn't just one Nurcu movement, but we can talk about a variety of positions within Nurcu movements, including Gülenists as well. But please go ahead.
Yeah, I talk about this tension between the Gülenists and the Zehra, the Kurdish Zehra circles, which also publish Said Nursi's writings and also follow his teachings. So there is this debate among these Turkish Nurcu groups and Kurdish Nurcu groups, and the Kurdish Nurcu groups accuse especially the Gülenists of leaving out certain statements by Said Nursi, where he uses, for example, Kurdistan, or where he says the Kurds, or and I asked about this to some of the Turkish Nurcus that I talked to, and their answers were they said that, oh, like those paragraphs, those texts that we left out, they were not really important. And it was it was during, for example, like military regime times that we published these books. So we didn't really want to experience any problems with the rulers at the time, or we were trying to be more we were trying to be more comprehensive and not divisive, because they think that if they included these words, then it would be divisive if they said like Kurds or Kurdistan. So, and they avoided, they kind of avoided coming to terms with the fact that, they distorted these teachings and these writings, and they didn't publish it in the original form. I have included a quote, a long, lengthy quote by one of the Gülenists on this, where he says, oh, it doesn't really matter whether you use the Turkish word or the Kurdish word for this. Everyone understands if we use the Turkish word, but some people wouldn't understand it if we only use the Kurdish word. So it's really the way they justify it in their mind is it's interesting to observe, I would say. But there are definitely different Nurcu groups, and this internal debate among them is still ongoing.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, there isn't just one Nurcu movement. The most powerful was the Gülenists being provided the space by the government, the former allies, current foes. But at the same time, the kind of the division among the Nurcu movements, as you highlighted, have started actually quite early in the 80s when the Yeni Asya community, one of the Nurcu movements, had distorted the text, which Fulya Atacan, in one of her articles, I think in Journal of Middle East Studies, talk about all of the words that Said Nursi wrote about the Kurds and Kurdistan were replaced by the villager, Easterner, farmer, and these kind of things. So I think it indicates a lot. And when we talk about kind of the influence of these Nurcu movements, like on one hand, we have like kind of more Kurdish autonomous Zehra, Med Zehra communities. Of course, they are not that powerful because they don't have the whole state support that other groups enjoy to a certain extent or have enjoyed in a certain period. Said Nursi being a Kurd, does it really matter? I mean, Said Nursi, of course, didn't shy away from his Kurdish identity, but he had another, he was a scholar from another person, another period, Ottoman, post-Ottoman, early Republican period, and his propositions, I think, like, you know, in a way kind of provided a more modern interpretation of Quran within its temporal context, of course. But then, like, you know, like one being ethnically Kurdish doesn't assign him or her just like, you know, an authority to speak on all these matters. I mean, as it's obvious, like, you know, some Turkish generals were Kurdish, some Turkish PMs were Kurdish, but they were never really given the space, or like, you know, they were never really articulating anything about the Kurds. So at the end of the day, I think it's like kind of a paradox. So Dan Sellington is talking about this TV drama series, the Turkish TV drama Ethos, Bir Başkadır in Turkish. And I assume that you also have watched it. So he says,
I did.
I've recently watched the Turkish TV drama set in contemporary Istanbul and known as Ethos in English. It is a very interesting panorama, but some of the subtext is difficult for Westerners like myself to parse. One of the psychiatrists is a Kurd. What does her Kurdish origin signify to Turkish viewers?
So thank you for that question. It's I'm smiling because when watching this drama, we were wondering how Westerners or how how people from not from Turkey, how they would actually make sense of all these like really complex subtext or different groups that you actually find in Turkish society, and this the Kurdish psychiatrist. I mean, of course, her Kurdish origin might signify different things to different Turkish viewers, but in general, I think the average it is really hard to pin down an average Turkish take on a Kurdish person. But of course, we know that the Turkish society is very nationalist, and there is this anti-Kurdish stance that's very present in the Turkish society in general. But that psychiatrist specifically, she is one of the, her profile is one of the more acceptable, quote unquote, Kurds, because she doesn't really highlight her Kurdish identity, or she doesn't really bring up any political demand. And she's also her class. Like she comes from a lower class background, but she's now in the more like upper middle class, and that kind of makes it easier for her to pass as Turkish, or people wouldn't really know that she's Kurdish, and it is only when we are presented with her family members that we understand she's Kurdish. Up until a certain point, we don't even know that she's Kurdish, and that's very common in the Turkish society, because if you want to be accepted, by the majority Turkish population, you kind of have to pass as a Turkish person, or not harmful Kurdish person, right? Like, again, quote unquote, because and I think that's what she does. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my take on that representation in that drama.
Great take. If I may also add maybe something about the psychiatrist being Kurdish. Definitely, like, your reading of it in terms of the class, in terms of the being acceptable Kurd is very important. But we only learn that she is Kurdish in an invisible space within her, like, social familial network. So her Kurdishness is really suppressed in that public space because, like, it is kind of a requirement if she wants to climb the ladder. She needs to kind of suppress that public visibility about her language and identity. I think that is one thing that kind of indicates the broader issue around Kurdishness for the Kurds in Turkey and beyond. As a Kurd, I mean, like, there were many occasions, like, when I had to articulate in a Istanbulite Turkish, for example, to avoid the accent, avoid the association. And for many occasions, I think, like, for the Kurds, for those who have an accent, who are like kind of easily identifiable or in a precarious positions, working in the seasonal works, or in the farmings, or in the construction, it is not easy for them really to be acceptable, as in the psychiatrist case. Yeah. Another aspect of the family being Kurdish is that we see another sister who is veiled and practicing Muslim. And I think kind of it implicitly states like how in the Kurdish society, this division that is kind of like, propagated doesn't work, because in all of the Kurdish families, you would see some people with more religious or traditional tendencies, whereas you will see perhaps through education and through assimilation that takes place in this educational process, people also become like, have different stances and so on and so on. I'm not for this or that, but just I'm trying to highlight that this diversity is part of the Kurdish society. Yes, so I think this is all of the question that we have, but I have another question if you allow me to shoot it out. So I'm currently in the United States, and yesterday I took two cabs from some place to another. Both of our drivers were people from North Africa, Moroccan and Algerian. And this is the case also in London whenever I take a taxi or like, meet some people from the Muslim world, whether to be from Pakistan, from like, I don't know, Southeast Asia or Africa. Usually there is this glorification about Erdogan and about the Turkey and like, Islam and of course, like, kind of this populist discourses goes hand in hand with the soft power that is like kind of, implemented by Turkey in all of these places, whether to be in the example of establishing a school or like opening a well for drinking water, or just like taking some meat for the Eid al-Adha for some people in Africa and so on. But then the example of the Kurds who live just within the Turkish border, and that Islam cannot really unify Turks and Kurds. I wonder, what does it tell to the transnational Muslim communities? Mm-hmm. I mean, in a way, kind of, I feel the need to warn the Muslim fellas that the Turkish Islam is not really like, I mean, in many ways, it's just like, what the colonialism did, the classic colonialism did with kind of converting all people of Africa or the world to Christianity and so on and so on. So I was wondering, like, how do you locate this discussion? What does your book tell us about this Turkey's transnational Islamic efforts and soft power?
Well, I don't talk about that in the book, but I can just tell my my interpretation of. I can talk about my interpretation of it now. I mean, I don't talk about it in the book because it has to end at one point, right? Like, I cannot include everything in the book. But as you suggest, I think the book still is relevant to this discussion because I kind of try to show how this belief in Turkey as the leader of the Muslim world is very much powerful and very strong among Turkish Muslim communities, and it doesn't really matter like which kind of teachings that, even if they might have internal debates or internal disagreements, they still very much believe in Turkey being the leader of the Muslim world. So I think that type of like transnational attempts on the side of the AKP government also kind of symbolizes that. And they are really trying to highlight Turkey as the sole country that can lead the Muslim world, and they are bringing up this Ottoman past and they highlight this very much. So I think in that sense, it is very much there, and they are using it as even as a foreign policy tool at times, especially in Africa. As you say, there are now like a lot of economic agreements and all these between like some African countries and Turkey, and they all like they highlight this Muslim fraternity a lot in those attempts. And also in the Balkans, Turkey is leading a very active role as the leader of Muslims. And I think it still it resonates for a lot of Muslim communities. They still see Erdogan or Turkey as the savior of the Muslim world. And but as you say, I think, you know, like it could, if we could only warn everyone, it would be nice. But you know, yeah. So it's still very much, I think.
Good luck with that. Well, Professor Fatma Müge is thanking us for a wonderful discussion, and she's asking what are you both working on now. Maybe we could briefly highlight what we are working on.
Okay.
So Fatma Hocam, I am currently working on this project that is kind of a multi-sited ethnographic fieldwork of Turkish Islam beyond its borders. So I take the American, the British, German, and the French case as a comparative case, and I look at the Turkish mosques and the Muslim communities. And I try to kind of like, you know, have a more holistic, but also ethnographically grounded understanding of what Turkish Islam beyond its border means. And at the same time, I'm working on an article these days where I developed this concept of Islamist colonialism. So it's very relevant to the discussion we have, and kind of the main argument is like where, like, you know, when we talk about Islamism and its relation to colonialism, we see this attitude, or like kind of the majority of the scholarship would highlight, rightfully so, Islamism as a reaction to colonial or post-colonial governmentalities. But I think kind of this scholarship downplay or kind of dismiss the fact that Islamism itself, especially influenced by the imperial dreams of the Turkish Muslims, for example, or the Shia example, have themselves learned how to incorporate the religion and Islamism as a colonial tool, which I have talked in some other publications to a certain extent. And lastly, what I do is I am establishing a Kurdish ethnomusicology and oral history archives here at Yale University, where I kind of like bring together this massive collection of digitized Kurdish oral performances from the 20th century, as early as 1922, from Baghdad Radio to the collection of Erivan Radio in the 40s and 50s, so many vinyls and cassettes and so on and so on. So I'm kind of immersed in the lost voice. Okay, go ahead, Gülay.
Okay, and all these projects sound really interesting and fascinating. So I'm looking forward to the outcomes, the products that will come out of these projects. So I'm doing like two main projects, I would say. One is on internal diversity among Muslim immigrants in Germany. So I'm looking at how these political divisions travel to Germany among Turkish and Kurdish immigrants, but I'm also including Syrian immigrants who self-identify as Muslims. And I'm trying to highlight the problematic labeling of all these migrants as Muslims, because they have, and I'm trying to highlight the ethnic, the sectarian, the national, their national identity, like the differences, different identities that they have, because among the European public and politicians, it's very common to, just label all these immigrants as Muslims. And I'm trying to show that even though they might consider themselves Muslims, religion might not be the sole identity that they cling to. So I'm doing interviews with these immigrants, and I have another project now, which is a bit like further from this topic, but still related. It's also still related to the issue of belonging, citizenship. And it's on democratic decline, authoritarianism, and highly skilled migration. So in which I look at how authoritarianism affects highly skilled migration, but also immobility beyond exile and beyond forced migration. So I'm looking at this like in between a highly skilled people who are trying to make sense of the political transformation their country is going through, and whether like these decisions to stay, to migrate, or to return back, and what motivates these type of decisions. So those are the two main projects that I'm involved in right now.
Sounds fantastic, Gülay. Thank you very much. I think we're coming to the end of our discussion. It was a great presentation. Congratulations again on the publication of the book. I am the first-hand witness of how long it took from the preparation to the fieldwork, to the fieldwork process and the publication. I have read it. It's a great book. It's a great contribution, and I encourage everyone to read the book. And I would like to thank Dr. Cengiz Güneş, who offered us to have this session, and the Seftus family. Thank you very much for the audience, for this very engaging discussions and the participation. Have a good day.
Yeah, I agree with Mehmet. I second everything he said. Thank you so much to the organizers. Thank you, Mehmet, so much for this wonderful discussion. And thank you, of course, to the participants who tuned in tonight. And take care, everyone.
Have a good day.
Yeah,